Hi everybody. Happy Monday. There goes the phone. Guess not. Already technical difficulty. Okay, we're going to be graphing sine and cosine graphs. Told you that was coming. So here's the equation for sine and cosine. You need to know your amplitude, which is your distance from your midline, and you need to know how to find your period, which is still 2 pi over the absolute value of b. So we're still using skills we had from last week. Hopefully everything is showing up. I know my little thing's falling apart. Okay, so I drew a unit circle so I can kind of explain how we do the things we're doing. Like I introduced this a little bit last week. Like the way you find a complete cycle or a period is for sine is by saying 0 max 0 min 0. And now I'm going to show you this on a unit circle. So on a unit circle, if you recall, you go here 0. When you go all the way around the circle, you're back to 2 pi. Well, if I look at the unit circle at the ordered pair, the exact values of a unit circle, and look at sine, which is your y value, if I start here and I go, okay, here's my 0, and then sine is 1, that's your maximum value. Then I go back to 0 for sine, and then I go to -1, that's your minimum value, and then go back to 0. This is where you get 0, max, 0, min, 0. And that completes one period, one cycle, one unit circle. And then for cosine, which is your x value, it's max 0, min, 0, max. That's of course if there's no reflection. Same thing with sine. So you say you start at your maximum value, which is 1, then you go to 0, then you go to minimum, which is -1, then you go back to 0, and then you go back to maximum. That completes one period, one cycle, one circle. So these words are going to be very helpful when you're when you're doing the graphs. So we're going to start off with our standard form graphs, and we're just going to do a very basic sine graph of x. So on this sine graph of x, if you notice, your amplitude here is 1. So my a is just plain 1. And then for my period, my b is 1. So when I take 2 pi divided by 1, of course I get 2 pi. Now this is going to be really important here to break down your intervals. You have to make your own intervals. So to do this, here's a new step you have to learn. You take your period and you divide it by 4. So when I divide this by 4, I get 2/4, of course, is a half. So you get 1/2 pi. So every interval to 4, of course it starts at 0. So this would be right here, this would be 1/2 pi. So that would be 1/2 pi right here. So then this would be 2/2 pi. Well, 2/2 pi equals pi. Then this would be 3/2 pi. And this would be 4/2 pi, which equals 2 pi. And of course, if I kept going here, so 4/2 pi, the next one would be 5/2 pi. And I really don't want to write on that. So 1/2 pi, 2 over pi, which is pi, 3/2 pi, 4/2 pi, which is 2 pi. But you only need to go to 4 to make a complete cycle. Now, if I want to go backwards, because the cycle keeps going on forever for the graph, I can start here and you just take your 0 max, 0 min, 0, or we'll do that when we're graphing. Let's do our negatives first. So let's go do our negatives. So let's make that -1/2 over 2. And then this would be, of course, negative pi. I'll do that in a second. So let's graph here from 0. So let's go our 0, and what was our amplitude? 1. So here's our 1 and 1. 0, max, 0, min, 0, max. And then, of course, if I kept going, like this would be 5/2 pi, I would put another dot right here. Now, if I go ahead and draw my sine, remember we just keep going on forever and ever, if I want to show the negative direction, so I would just go backwards. So this is 0 here, then backwards this would be minimum down here, and then 0, min, 0. So 0, min, 0 would be here. And I could show how it would go if it went the other direction. Okay, so that's your sine graph. And it goes on forever and ever both directions. Infinite both directions. So your domain would be negative infinity to positive infinity. Okay, so the cosine graph, if you look at number 2, the cosine graph is exactly the same thing. Your amplitude is 1 here. Your period would be 2 pi over 1, which is 2 pi. So there's my period for this one. Same thing. And then to break it down into units of 4, you would take 2 pi divided by 4, and we're going to get the same intervals as we have here. So I'm going to graph cosine graph on the same one so you can see. So if I look at the words, it's just max 0, min, 0, max. So I'm going to start at the maximum value, which would be 1, and then it's going to go max 0, min, 0, max, and then back down to 0. So this would go on, and then let's go the backwards. So if I go backwards, max, there's your max, so this would go 0, and then min, and then back up to 0. So your cosine graph is in red. And there's your cosine graph. So there's sine and cosine. So let's do some that aren't quite as easy. They're still the same, they're just not quite as easy. So let me scoot it up just a little bit. And I'll slow this down a little bit. So number 3 is going to be, make sure, nope, you're not on there very well. My poor little stoop is falling apart. Yep, I think it's gonna, there we go. Technical difficulties with my little stand. Get my eyes on. Come on, just last through this video, and I'll make a new one. I think you can kind of see that. Okay, so number 3. So I look here and I got, okay, negative 2 is my A, so my amplitude, the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. Okay, remember that's the distance from the midline. And then to find my period, I'm going to take 2 pi divided by the absolute value of negative 2. So the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. And then this cancels out. So my period is pi. So my period here is pi. And there's my amplitude A. Okay, so now we have to take and we have to break it down into units. So I'm going to take my period and I'm going to divide it by 4. I'm going to take my time on this one. I'm going to show you something. So when you're breaking it down into fourths, this is like 1/4. So let's watch. So this would be like 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, and if you keep going, 5/4, 6/4, 7/4, 8/4. That's all you're doing for your intervals. You're just counting by fourths. Of course, we're going to simplify, and we're going to add pi to the end of it, and then we're going to do the negative. So on this line right here, I hope you can see it's very light blue. We've got our origin. So this would be our, right here, this would be our 1/4 pi, or pi over 4. There's 1/4 pi. 2/4 pi, of course, reduces to 1/2. So this would be pi over 2. 3/4 pi, can't simplify. 4/4 pi would be pi. So that would complete one cycle right there. If I wanted to keep going to show more cycles, if I just wanted to go to the end of my line, then I would just keep going, and then the next one would be 5/4 pi. Of course, the next one would be 6/4 pi, which we would reduce, divide by 2, 3/2 pi, and so on. Then when you would have 7/4 pi, and you would just keep going and going and going and going. Okay? So that's how you do that. And then let's do our negative. So just take this and just go backwards and do a negative. So negative pi over 4, negative pi over 2. And that's far enough. We'll just do the negatives. We'll just do a couple. Okay, now our amplitude, remember it was a negative. Okay, that's going to be important in a minute. But I still can do this. I can mark my amplitude up and down 2. And then we got to remember, okay, it's sine. So sine was 0 max, 0 min, and then 0. But because there's a negative there, negative means on all graphs that it's a reflection. So instead of going 0 max, I'm going to change this max to a min. And then I got 0, and then this is going to be a max. So that's how I'm going to graph my reflection. And say, instead of saying maximum, I'm going to say minimum. So right here, we're doing sine. Remember, I'm going to start at 0, and then I'm going to go down. I'm going to go down to minimum, and then back up to 0, and then I'm going to go up to maximum. And then I'm going to go back down to 0. There's one complete cycle. Right there is one complete cycle, because 0, minimum, 0, maximum, 0. And then I could keep going as far as my graph goes if I want to. So right here, 0, minimum, 0, maximum, and then I can go backwards a little bit. So I start here, and I'm at 0, and then I'll go to maximum, and then from maximum I go back down to 0. So there is your sine graph. And that's it. And then it goes on forever and ever and ever. Okay, so the last one I want to do is, of course, going to be a cosine graph. I think you can still see that. Take that out of the way. So if you can't see it, it's a 3 cosine of 4x. So on this one, our amplitude, the absolute value of 3 is a equals 3. To find my period, remember it's 2 pi divided by, whoa, okay, that's a terrible, hold on, 2 pi divided by 4. So my period is 1/2 pi. So my period here is 1/2 pi, or just pi over 2. Now, that's my period, but I have to divide it into 4 units. So if I divide that by 4, it looks kind of funky. So what you can do, instead of dividing by 4, it's the same thing as multiplying by 1/4. Dividing by 4 is the same thing as multiplying by 1/4. So I've got pi over 2 times 1/4 equals pi over 8. So again, guys, that's 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, 4/8. 5/8, 6/8, 7/8, 8/8. That's how you can do it. So on here, I'm just going to go ahead and write. So this will be 1/8 or pi over 8. The next one would be 2/8. I'm going to write it down here so you can see it. That would simplify to pi, oh crap, sorry. Pi, oh, I shouldn't say crap. Pi over 4. Then the next one here would be 3/8, or, and that doesn't simplify, so 3/8 pi. And then 4/8 would be 1/2 pi. And then I could do the next one, which would be 5/8. I keep wanting to write this instead of my tick marks. And then if I go backwards, we'll just go backwards 1, because I'm trying to beat the 15 minutes. That would be a -1. And there's my 0. Okay, so this is cosine. There is no reflection because it's just a +3 at the beginning. So when I start graphing this one, it's cosine. So I'm going to start up here at my maximum, because if you recall, cosine is maximum, 0, minimum, 0, maximum. So we're going to start at 3, 1, 2, 3. There's my maximum. I'm going to go down to 0. Then I'm going to go to my minimum. Wow, that's running out. Perfect timing. And then 1, 2, 3. Then I'm going to go back to 0, and then I'm going to go up to maximum. 1, 2, 3. And that completes one cycle. But I already went to 5/8, so I'm going to go this way. And then if I want to hit this -1/8, I'm going to go backwards. So I'm already at my maximum, so I'm going to go back down to 0. So then if I complete my cosine graph, there you go. There's your cosine graph. Okay. Oh.